morning, everyone. Our sermon this morning begins with a reading from Matthew chapter 24. And Jesus is speaking to the disciples and the apostles. And he says, "Beware that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will hand you over to be tortured, and you will be put to death. And you will be hated by nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this is good news. Good news of the dominion will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." In our sermon this morning, I want to talk about something that can be very frustrating when you're on the mystical path. The path of transformation, the path towards self-realization, the path that requires an examination of your entire being. And most people interpret this passage outwardly, meaning we look around and we go, well, these are the beginnings of these end times that we have heard about, where the world is at war with each other, and there's famines, and there's earthquakes, and nations are rising against nations, and there's just conflict. And in the midst of that, Jesus is saying, you as a follower of Christ will be persecuted and tortured and put to death. And the whole earth will take on this energy of lawlessness. And as a result, many people's love will grow cold. In other words, their desire to fulfill the pattern of the soul and to love God and to live the ways of Christ will weaken, because it's difficult to do that in the thick of a very hateful environment. So you maybe experience some degrees of that, because from my own experience, living as a being who is striving to fulfill the patterns of Christ, you come up against a lot of difficulties in dealing with other people, dealing with governments, and dealing with institutions, and dealing with attorneys, and dealing with medical issues, and insurance, and money, and greed, and selfishness, and jealousy, and people being unfaithful. And there's a lot of options to exercise the ways of the ego and to live, quote unquote, more along the lines of perpetuating evil, as opposed to choosing what's often called the road less traveled, and a desire to, no matter what, forgive others and live to your highest good, even if it's somewhat torturous. In addition to that, I want to examine the prospect of this passage as an inner experience. And I want to give you some fuel for what is quite universal as you walk this path. Times when you can become just utterly weary and burdened with how much examination has to go on, and how much shedding of the old ways you have to do, and how much realizing the degrees to which your ego and your selfishness have sort of squeezed out the life from your soul. And how many wounds and habits how many wounds you have suffered, how many habits you have picked up, concepts that have become calcified inside and really dictate how you think, and to what degree how you feel, and just decisions that you make. Recently, somebody used the term demoralizing. It's demoralizing to continually have to chip away at this. When will it be over? I know that there is something inside of us that wants it to be over so that we can be in paradise. We can be in that feeling of like, it was grueling, but it's over. And for those of you who have competed in really intense athletics, or you've run a marathon, or even if you've run something really intense like a triathlon or an Ironman, or you've played a game and it's just been so demanding, and you have to keep yourself together until it ends. I want you to walk with me as we talk about the last 3 days, or the 3 days of Jesus' Passion. Now that happened over a very concentrated period. But I want you to try to connect with the anguish of every one of those steps. And to what degree he may have been saying, "Oh Lord, can this please be the end?" So first of all, he realizes that one of his friends, Judas, is planning to betray him. And he is trying to convey to Judas that he knows what he's planning to do, and he really should not do it. Not so much for his sake, for Jesus' sake, because he knows that he has to go through the passion and the arrest and the crucifixion. That's part of the mission that he signed on for. But the anguish of knowing that a friend of his was going to incite the process, was going to betray him to the authorities. I mean, if you can imagine somebody that you care deeply about, somebody that you would do anything for. Now, I mean, Judas, as we pick up in the gospel, and if you read more of the mystical writings, he was a difficult guy. He was a very smart guy, he was a good-looking guy, and he was a very egotistical guy. He thought he was better than the apostles, and yet he felt that Jesus was treating him like he was worse than the apostles. It's just that he wasn't humble, and he didn't acknowledge his shortcomings very easily. He believed that Jesus was meant to be the one to liberate the Jews from the Roman rule, and he wanted to be kind of like his right-hand man, like his political manager. And Jesus was like, it has nothing to do with that. I'm not here to liberate people from the Romans. I'm here to liberate people from the concepts of sin, of the darkness and the weirdness that lives inside. That's what I'm here to liberate. That's the king that I am. And Judas just couldn't hear it because he wasn't willing to realize the degrees to which he was consumed in that egotism and that selfishness and that narrow-mindedness and that pride around being intelligent and good-looking and accomplished. So he was a difficult friend in that sense, but Jesus was so evolved that he just saw the sadness in that, and he cared deeply for this man. So think about somebody in your life that you care deeply for and you would do anything for. And you realize that they're planning to do something to really take you down. Like, for example, they're going to plant drugs in your car, and then they're going to call the authorities, and the cops are going to show up, and they're going to search your car, and they're going to find drugs, like a big quantity of drugs, and then you're going to prison, like for 10 or 15 years. And you know, I mean, you haven't touched drugs your whole life, you're not interested in drugs. But all of a sudden this happens. And you look over at this person, whether it's your son, your parent, your best friend, your wife, your girlfriend, whoever, somebody that you were like, oh my God, I was willing to die for you and still am. And this is what you have done to me. So Jesus is arrested. And as he is marched from where they're at into the city of Jerusalem, he's being whipped and beaten. And they're laughing at him. He's chained up, and if you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of the Christ, you'll see that he's chained up in a weird way. It's difficult to walk, and yet they're whipping him. Now, I don't know if you've ever had one lash of a whip. I personally have not. But as it's depicted in the movies, one lash of the whip splits open the skin. It's got to be excruciating. So he's being whipped as he goes in, all the time, probably emotionally stewing on, oh my God, I can't believe what this person did. And that's just the beginning. It's like we're just beginning this, now he's going to be taken into the authorities, or if we follow through this drug planting analogy, you're going to go through time in a jail, and then you're going to have to wait for a trial, and then they're going to go, well, we found the drugs, and the sentencing, and then you're off to prison. I mean, it's like the beginning of hell. So Jesus is now being marched in, and he's delivered to the religious authorities. And the religious authorities basically go on this tirade about how he is just proclaiming blasphemy. In reality, Jesus has been missioned by God to be the Messiah. And all these people are speaking up against him and basically preparing a case to take to the Romans so that they can ask that he be executed. And in the meantime, they're spitting on him, and they're beating him, and they're mocking him, and they're just basically humiliating him. And think about the anguish now on top of that. First of all, your body has been whipped, your face has been punched in, and now they're yelling at you, they're degrading you, they're degrading God, and they're proclaiming to be the high priests and the mediators of God, telling you, the actual mediator, the humble mediator of God, the Christed one, that you are blasphemous. Can you imagine the emotional angst of that? And then another physical beating. Then he's turned over to the authorities, and he is basically chained up overnight. Now, think about a time when you've had an injury. I mean, like, seriously, if somebody's beaten your face, which I don't know if you've ever had that experience. But you're sitting there, or you're hanging there, tied up, no pain relief, no ice to take on the swelling, tremendous emotional angst, realizing that you've been betrayed by somebody that you care deeply about, and it's only going to get worse from here. And you spend the whole night just kind of in this incredible discomfort. Then the next day, brought before Pilate. Pilate gives you the opportunity to, I don't know what, speak on behalf of yourself, and God does not want you to, because you have signed on to go through with this. So you don't have the option. Now, if you don't think that brings upon anguish, I mean, how often can you be accused of something and say nothing and not defend yourself at all? That is very difficult to do. There is an incredible, intense desire within to speak your truth and to defend yourself. And Jesus hardly said anything. He said a couple of things, very profound things. But he had a certain calmness about him, because he knew he had to go through this. So he is ordered to be scourged. And again, if you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of the Christ, I mean, the scourging is almost unwatchable. It is so brutal. And think again, put yourself in the position of Jesus. And he is being beaten by people who are actually sadistically enjoying it. And everybody's sitting around watching him, or standing around watching this happening, like this some sort of entertainment. And he's basically being beaten within a few strokes of his life. I mean, can he not be thinking, Lord, please let it end? And he hasn't even had to walk to Calvary and then be nailed to the cross and then bleed to death, which are the next steps, right? First of all, I mean, when you get that kind of physical destruction to your body goes into high fever. It's trying somehow to repair itself, even though on some level your mind has to go, there's no way I'm getting repaired from that kind of beating. And he's in this incredible, shivering, feverish state. He's bled half his blood out. He's probably as thirsty as all get out. And there's no relief. They put the crown of thorns on him. They puncture his scalp with the thorns. And they put some uncomfortable, like, purple robe on him, and they mock him as though he's the king. And then he is required to carry this incredibly heavy cross. I mean, again, think of a cross that can bear the weight of a man. I mean, these are huge tree trunks carved into a cross, and then he is having to drag this thing, I don't know how many miles it was, out of the city of Jerusalem up to Calvary, and it's rubbing against his wounds, and he's being whipped. Like, let's go, get on with it. I mean, the torture of it is hard to conceive of. But would he not be thinking, oh Lord, like, is this not the end? I mean, how much more can I take? He gets to the top of Calvary, and then they drive the nails into his flesh and bone. I mean, it's tragic. Again, it's almost unbearable to watch. And then to watch a man go through this without complaining. I mean, there were cries of anguish, physical pain. But he actually says, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." So his heart has not become embittered by what he's going through. And then he is forced to hang up on the cross. And all those people, well, 11 of the 12 apostles did not come to the most, you could say, one of the most important moments in all of history, to watch the sacrifice of Jesus, the Lamb of God, in order that humanity would be granted a pass of forgiveness. And they were frightened, and they were freaked out, so they didn't come, except for John. How does that affect you emotionally, the anguish of that, to go through this horrific experience and to not have the friends who have been with you and you've prepared them for this and you've told them over and again, this is what's going to happen and it's good because after 3 days I'm going to rise again. And they didn't come. And he had to hang up there as his body slowly dripped out the last of its blood. And the weight of his body pulled him down heavier until he couldn't breathe. And whether he died from lack of blood or suffocation, I mean, the anguish. Okay, so I think I've painted a pretty dismal picture. Now remember, what Jesus goes through, he demonstrated outwardly, and this is what we experience inwardly. So there will be times when you're probably a third of the way through this incredibly anguishing experience known as personal transformation. And why is it so anguishing? I think because we want love. We want the love of God to just engulf us and everything is okay. And that's what God wants. But because we have tried to survive in a world that is not particularly godly, that is very driven by sex and power and money and just me against you and egotistical misconceptions, we have a world that forces you, if you don't know God and you don't know Christ, it forces you to adapt in order to try to get your needs met, in order for you to make it through life. And now, the transformation process requires that all of that fall away. Sometimes referred to as the destruction of the temple. The temple in which you have lived for all your life is a construct of these mechanisms designed to protect you and designed to empower you and designed to figure out ways for you to get the things that you need. And that has to come down. And, you know, it's painful. It's painful when your temple is destroyed. And we want it to be faster, and we want to go, I think that's it. Let me assure you that it's not for us to say that's it, because you'll probably be disappointed. And then when you think it's over, when you think you've reached the end of a particular pattern and you realize that you haven't, then you can have that feeling of being demoralized because it's like, ugh. Speaking from my own experience, you know, even as a teenager, I had this draw to the truth. I wanted to know the truth. I wanted to know what is possible for a human being to accomplish. I don't mean great athlete and great wealth and all this. I mean, like, spiritually, what is the essence of a human being? And over the course of my 20s and 30s, I was very active in looking for teachers and going to lectures and attending seminars and enrolling in courses and learning various, what I thought were spiritual tools. And some of them were. And some of them, you know, were interesting, but they were a little bit of like tangents away from the truth. Then in 2004, which right now is 2018, in 2004, 14 years ago, I stumbled upon an organization that was teaching the way of Christ, the way into self-realization. And I was able to work with teachers, priests, one-on-one. And so they were beginning to, or they were able to now see my specific patterns and wounds and concepts and ideas about how to find the truth, and they were able to help me refine it. And that was amazing, and still is. But I can't stand here 14 years later as a priest and say, it's done. I can say, it appears as though certain things are finished. What I mean by that is ways that I used to be when I first came upon the path. I came to realize that those were not healthy ways of being, even though they served me on some level. And I had to figure out, well, where did the pattern start and why did it start? And I had to forgive the people who had wounded me initially in order that that pattern became something that made sense. And then I had to undo the habitual behaviors that I didn't even realize I was doing. And then I had to be vigilant for a long time afterwards because I still felt the temptation to want to do those things. At some point, the temptation really went away. I mean, I can share with you when I was in my 20s and I was playing in bands and occasionally, not super often, but it was part of the lifestyle to smoke drugs. And I liked smoking drugs with my friends in the band and playing music and being on the road and just kind of living that lifestyle that, I don't know, was kind of cool. And then there was a point where, you know, I could feel smoking drugs kind of like made my head cloudy and it wasn't that much fun and you know, it was kind of irritating. But there was the memory of the good times. And there was sort of like, well, I'm not really getting to those good times anymore, but maybe this time I will. And so for a long time, you know, when I would go to parties and hang out with people and they would light something up, I would indulge in it, even though part of me was like, it's not going to be good. Another part of me was like, well, maybe it will be good. So I couldn't say it was finished. I wanted it to be finished because then many of the times, not all of them, but many of the times if I did smoke and then, you know, we'd have a few laughs and then the group would break up and then I'd be kind of alone and stoned and, you know, not in a good state. It was like, I don't want to be this way. I want to just clear this away, and I couldn't because, you know, then the stuff has to work through your system. Until finally I was like strong enough to go, you know, I remember those times when somebody would light it up and there was the smell and the memory of it and it was like, this doesn't work out well for me. So I had resisted it. And then finally it was like, I have no interest at all, which is how it is now. I have no interest at all. But I still have the memory of many good times that I had sitting around with friends and indulging in those kind of things. So in the passage today, you know, Jesus talks about all these various rounds of difficulty. First there will be this, and then nations against nations, and then famines and earthquakes, and it still won't be the end. And then there will be many who will rise up and claim to be the Messiah, but don't believe them because they will lead you astray. And then because of the lovelessness on the planet, many's love will grow cold, but it's still not the end. And then those who persevere and continue, there will come an end to whatever it is that you are trying to overcome. But when you are in those states of going like, really? There's more? I want you to think of Jesus in that, you know, in that progression of Garden of Gethsemane and taking on the energy of the sins of the world, and then being betrayed by a good friend, and then being whipped as you're walked into town, and then being humiliated and accused of being, you know, some blasphemous individual who says that God is within and you can know God, and then spit on and beat up and then hung overnight in all your wounds, and then the next day you are accused of this and that and you're not allowed to defend yourself, and then you are whipped to, you know, within a few inches of your life, and it goes on until you're nailed to a cross and you're hung up, and for hours you just hang there as your body, you know, drips out its last vestiges of life. Just tune into that agony. Now, if I was trying to sell the path, you'd probably go like, you're not doing a great job here. Well, I understand, but, you know, this is real. Letting go of difficult things, seeing yourself and the patterns that you live and the way that you think and the way that you emote and the way that you communicate and the way that you relate, and realizing that it's not in accord with God, that is painful. That is hard. And for me, I was like, well, just tell me what I'm doing and let me fix it and let me get on with it. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. It's a gradual, you see it and then you implement with incredible will and you pray for the grace of God to support you as you take on these new ways of being. And as you're taking on, the world is not really changing, right? So it's like you're being forced into situations where you are now living this higher consciousness and the world is still mired in its difficulty. And so people are going to see you possibly, they're going to accuse you of being weak or soft or, just kind of awkward because you're no longer living in the way that they are. And that's another form of anguish, that separation, that isolation that you face. And possibly, somebody wants to make sarcastic comments. Oh, you're getting all meditation now. And you're not supposed to say anything. You're not supposed to defend yourself because forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. So I want to give you strength because we've just come through Easter and we have resurrected into a new consciousness of love. But I don't want you thinking, well, I'm done. This is great. I mean, you'll have periods where it'll just be smooth and you'll be carried by the grace and you'll feel great. You'll feel the energy of spring and the life that's coming up on the planet as something that's happening within you, and it's joyful and you're energized. And good things begin to manifest. New relationships, new jobs, new places to live. Like the spring is the time of newness. But don't be burdened if and when you realize that there are aspects of your process that are not complete. Be patient and have faith. As Jesus said, the end will come for those who persevere.